This episode contains graphic content that may not be suitable for all ages. Listener discretion is advised. If you or someone you know is struggling or in crisis, help is available. Call or text 988 or chat with someone at 988lifeline.org. Those outside of the US, reach out to someone at your local crisis center or hotline. Please do not suffer in silence. Edna Therrell Booty was born on January 21st, 1919 in New York's 5th borough, Staten Island. Throughout her life, she would usually go by a shortened version of her middle name, Terry. Having grown up in Staten Island, Edna, or Terry rather, would end up marrying and taking on her husband's surname, MacDonald. John, her husband, was a businessman who would later become a councilman in Rhode Island, where they lived together, and their family would go on to include 4 children. After spending years taking care of her family as a housewife and a caregiver, Terry decided to branch out of her comfort zone as she approached middle age. In the late 1960s, as she approached the age of 50, Terry told her friends that she needed something to do to occupy her time now that her children were all grown up. She decided to take up real estate, becoming a realtor, showing and selling homes to prospective clients. In April of 1971, 52-year-old Terry McDonald was contacted by a prospective client, a male who, per the Democrat and Chronicle, wanted to see brand new homes with people not living in them. This client, who went by the name Peter Morgan, contacted Terry via telephone and seemed to orchestrate his viewing well ahead of time. He claimed to be a business executive from Union City, New Jersey, who was looking to move to the region with his family. He wanted to view recently constructed homes that had not been lived in before, and was willing to pay upwards of $50,000, potentially as high as $60,000, a price that, back in 1971, could fetch you some pretty sweet digs. Peter Morgan, this client, made an appointment with Terry to view homes that Thursday, April 29th. However, early on the day of, he phoned her office to let her know that he had some bad news. His car had broken down, and he wasn't sure if he would be able to make their appointment. Terry and he were able to find a solution, though. She could pick him up at the hotel he'd been staying at, drive him around to view the homes later that afternoon, and then drive him back. Terry was last seen leaving the E.S. Child Jr. real estate firm she worked at along County Road at around 4:30 p.m., but would make a brief trip back home to pick up a measuring tape and a flashlight, because the homes that she would be showing were newly constructed, and most did not have electricity hooked up quite yet. While at home, she called another real estate salesman to check on the availability of one of the 3 homes she was planning to show her client, who sat waiting in her car in the driveway of her home. She then headed out, telling her 2 youngest daughters that she would be back soon. Sadly, she wasn't. As the hours passed, Terry's daughters began to grow concerned that something had happened to their mother. They started calling around, eventually calling over some family friends at around 2 o'clock the following morning. Their father, Terry's husband, John, happened to be away on business that week, so it wasn't until the following morning that Terry was finally reported missing. Detectives would begin to look around for Terry that Friday, after ruling out any of the other possibilities, such as car accident, staying at a nearby hotel or motel, etc. After that, they decided to search the 3 homes that she had been preparing to show her client the prior afternoon, with the first home revealing nothing. The second and third homes were locked, but a cursory search from the outside revealed them to look empty. It wasn't until later that evening that keys for the homes could be found, and officers attempted to search the second property, a newly constructed colonial-style home in a neighborhood full of them. At around 10 p.m., a detective searched 24 Heritage Road, which was located less than 5 minutes away from where Terry lived with her family, near New Meadow Road in Barrington, Rhode Island. Things looked almost entirely undisturbed for the most part, but a shocking discovery would be made down in the basement that evening. Terry McDonald had been strangled to death with her own nylon stocking, which had been ripped off of her at some point before her death. Her body was found laying on the basement floor, but a rope had been looped around her neck, with the other end tied around an overhanging water pipe. Although her body was found laying on the basement floor near the far wall, her head had been elevated a few inches off of the cement floor because of the rope tied rather tightly around her neck from behind. Tape found nearby indicated that she had been bound and gagged with it beforehand. Terry had suffered a significant blow to the head, and an examination of her body found several broken fingernails. Surprisingly, she had not been sexually assaulted in any way, but that did not change the mystery of what had happened, with neither rape nor robbery proving to have been a motivation in this strange murder. As police would theorize days later, Terry had likely been targeted by someone they declared a psychopath to the press. In the weeks and months that followed, as her family and community grieved her sudden and shocking loss, authorities attempted to identify the killer of 52-year-old Terry McDonald. In a unique twist, they found that she was not the only realtor to be contacted by this mysterious man in recent weeks. In fact, many other female realtors, most of whom were attractive, had been contacted by a man using similar generic names: Peter Morgan, Peter Rogers, Charles Murray. Almost all described him as a well-dressed, neat, and articulate man who presented himself as kind and cordial. Yet in every instance he gave an identical backstory. He was a businessman from New Jersey who was relocating to the area with his wife and 3 children. In some instances, these realtors and real estate agents had gone to view homes with this prospective client, who basically ghosted them afterward. After viewing these homes, the man never contacted them again for any follow-ups or additional showings. Yet he seemed to do so with Terry, leading investigators to theorize that this killer had chosen her of all the other potential female realtors. For this reason, detectives could only assume that something specific to Terry set her apart from the others. Maybe it was her physical characteristics, maybe it was the fact that her husband was out of town, or maybe it was due to her age, with Terry being just a little bit older than many of the other realtors and real estate agents. If this killer had been looking for a type, then Terry had apparently been it. Yet, for what specific reason, investigators were never able to ascertain. They were not able to discern what had set Terry apart from the others, why she, of all people, had been marked for death. She had no known enemies, and no one had any reason to wish her harm. Yet for some reason, Terry's killer had methodically led her down to an empty basement in Barrington, Rhode Island, where he eventually snuffed out her life with a nylon stocking, not for money or even for more carnal reasons, but apparently just to kill her. Afterward, this killer had tied a rope around Terry's neck and displayed her body in a strange way, as if he had been trying to send a message. But that message would remain undeciphered for quite some time. Many would argue it remains undeciphered to this day. More than half a century later, the murder of Edna Terry McDonald remains technically unsolved. However, federal authorities believe they know who was responsible: a career criminal whose level of sadism and depravity seems to have known no bounds or limits. A man who was known to traverse the country in pursuit of his strange and deplorable urges, which were funded by his illicit counterfeiting scheme. Years after this, authorities would press charges against this man for Terry's murder, having uncovered evidence linking him to it and other similar crimes, almost all of which were committed years later. He was never tried for this crime in particular, due to a variety of reasons we'll explore later on in the series. But federal investigators believe that Mike DeBardeleben had killed Terry McDonald, having orchestrated this entire scenario just to carry out this crime against her in particular. Yet, this crime stands alone as just one of a few murders linked to this offender, also known as the Mall Passer, and happened nearly a decade before most of his other known, alleged, speculative, or theorized crimes took place. For that reason, authorities believe that this is highly unlikely to have been the only similar violent crime Mike DeBardeleben committed during this time period, during which he began to establish himself as an absolute monster to those closest to him. Part 3: Accomplices. Shortly after his stint at Western State Hospital in Virginia, where he was diagnosed as antisocial and sociopathic for the first time, Mike DeBardeleben would meet and marry another young woman. A 19-year-old from a small town in southwestern Virginia, his young wife Faye dreamed of moving away from the small town that she grew up in, and seemingly jumped at her first chance to do so. When they first met, Mike doted upon Faye, sweeping her off of her feet. She would later recount to Secret Service investigators, as reported by Stephen Michaud in his book Lethal Shadow. "When I met him, I had just turned 19. Emotionally, I was probably 15 or 16. He was very sophisticated, very nice-looking, very well-dressed, very flattering. I had never met a man like this. I had never been in a nice restaurant. I had no insight in dealing with people like him. I believed everything I was told. At that time, I believed everybody was good and honest, and that you could see a crook on the street and that you would recognize him. I believed this." Soon after meeting, the two married. Faye continued, "He gradually led me into taking nude photographs, and then they became worse and worse and worse. He eventually had pictures of me engaged with him in various sex acts. He had pictures of me tied up and him hurting me." Mike DeBardeleben had already established a system for his wives, which, as you heard in the last episode, were multiple at this point. They were always younger than him, in certain cases, much younger. He would woo them and somehow convince them that he was the ultimate gentleman, and would propose early, marrying them often within just months. After that, he would attempt to isolate them, cutting them off from their friends and family, and making them dependent upon him for all of their basic needs. Once he got them there, he would set out to brutalize them in ways that are uncomfortable to even describe. As you just heard from Faye's statement to investigators, Mike would tie up his wives and subject them to hours of abuse, sometimes days. Not just emotional and physical abuse, but rough sexual abuse, which included beatings, torture, and sex acts. Stuff like nipple torture and rough anal sex, for starters. More often than not, he would photograph and record this process on his tape recorder. Afterward, Mike DeBardeleben would tell his wives that they needed to do exactly what he told them. If they didn't, he promised to distribute those photos and audio recordings to their family members, their friends, their colleagues, their fellow churchgoers, etc. And if they didn't listen, then the abuse would be worse next time. Although that was almost always a certainty, no matter what they did. The abuse never ended. Mike would also begin to step out on his wives with other young women, who were themselves similarly victimized. He would then use them as ammunition against his wives, letting them know that he had choices. They didn't. He would show Faye photos and audio recordings of abuse that he had inflicted upon other women in the past, making it clear that he had done this many times before, not just with the women that he married. During his marriage to Faye, Mike would rape a young woman alongside one of her cousins in Prince George's County, Maryland. Mike and this cousin were later charged with kidnapping, sodomy, and assault, but they were acquitted because the victim had apparently gotten into the car willingly with the two men. Back in the 1960s, that was apparently enough to write her off as a victim of kidnapping or rape, with the jury finding it hard to believe her claims that she had been raped by the two men because she willingly got into the car with them. After this close call with the law, Mike continued on unabated with his various machinations, which centered around his wife, Faye. Once he'd broken down his wives as much as he could, Mike DeBardeleben would make them his accomplices for various robbery and extortion schemes. His first well-known scheme was one that he used to ensnare elderly folk into giving over money, similar to the extortion schemes that you hear about to this day. Mike would pose as a banking official or a federal agent of some kind, and would convince elderly individuals, particularly older women, that they had been victims of a scam. In order to fix things, they needed to go to the bank, withdraw some money, and bring it back to him. That's a very rough and simplified explanation of it, but Mike's scheme had many more moving parts to it. Some of you probably have family members or acquaintances that have fallen prey to similar schemes perpetrated by scammers using the phone or the internet. Well, Mike DeBardeleben was doing these schemes face-to-face more than half a century ago, and ensnared his wife Faye into helping him as this scheme evolved. In April of 1969, Faye was brought in to assist Mike on a different type of scheme. This one was much more openly villainous. Mike had spent weeks surveilling the manager of a bank branch and decided to kidnap the bank manager's wife at gunpoint, using her voice over the phone to ensure the manager followed through with Mike's instructions. His instructions included withdrawing $60,000 from the bank and dropping it at a predetermined location. Faye was responsible for leaving notes behind at the various locations to change details, so that if the police got involved, it would not lead to the actual drop site. Faye would then arrange the pickup of the cash herself, while Mike held the bank manager's wife at gunpoint at a separate location. In that robbery from April of 1969, they got away with roughly $34,000, none of which was ever recovered. Faye would remain Mike's wife, accomplice, and captive for several years. She became pregnant at one point, but that pregnancy ended by Mike literally pushing her down a flight of stairs. When she became pregnant a second time, Mike demanded that she get an abortion. She refused to. His continued insistence that she get an abortion, something she heavily disagreed with, gave her the courage to strike out on her own in August of 1969. She would give birth to her daughter months later, in April of 1970. Later, Mike would track her down and attempted to rape her in her apartment, but she was able to scream and draw attention to the residents. After that, Mike became less and less of a presence in her life, but he would still make appearances every now and then to visit with his child, usually in the company of another woman. Faye was ultimately granted a divorce and was able to rid herself of Mike DeBardeleben, but she would never be able to fully rid herself of the scars that he had inflicted upon her, not all of which were physical. At this point, Mike had already found himself another wife. That's after the break. Mike DeBardeleben's pursuit of his fourth wife, Karen, almost exactly mirrored that of his previous three wives. A high school senior when they met, Mike was an attractive older man, and he began showering her with compassion and putting on a good show for some time. The two married in July of 1970, when Karen was just 18 years old. Mike was 30. After they were officially married, Mike's acts of degradation began. He set out to make Karen subservient to him in almost every way, mind, body, and spirit. Before long, he would begin to use Karen in his various bank schemes and robberies, which were almost identical to the ones he had carried out beforehand with Faye. All the while, he continued on with his various forms of abuse against Karen, which I'll spare you the specific details of. In 1972, Mike attempted to open up his first and only legitimate business, which, as you can imagine, was every bit as seedy as he was. A business titled The Naked Eye, this was a nude modeling service located in Washington, D.C.'s red light district, where people could rent out the space, the cameras, and even models. As you can imagine, this rather niche business folded rather quickly, and Mike resorted back to his illegitimate schemes soon thereafter. For a time, Mike and Karen relocated down to Texas to help take care of his ailing mother, Mo. His father, Mike Sr., had passed away a few years beforehand, in 1966. His mother would follow in September of 1973, after suffering from cancer for some time. There, when living down in Texas, Karen was witness to a violent crime that Mike had committed, the prolonged rape and assault of a young woman, who he had kidnapped while Karen was in the hospital. She tried to convince Mike to let the young woman go mostly unharmed, but wasn't ever sure if he did so. After years of abuse herself, Karen's memory remained damaged after the fact. In 1975, Karen would seek to escape Mike's clutches, utilizing some legal help to establish a new identity for herself in a new city, far away from the clutches of her estranged husband. Yet, he would use private investigators to track her down, something that investigators would learn after his arrest, nearly an entire decade later. After Mike's arrest for the mall passer counterfeiting scheme in 1983, Secret Service agents would catch up with Karen. They would find her to be so emotionally damaged due to her life with Mike that it was tough for her to remember or talk about their time together, entire years of her life that had been, drowned out due to repeated abuse. They sought to look her up because one of the first tapes they uncovered in Mike's storage locker had her name printed on it, and was an audio recording of that abuse. Yet everything that Karen had endured had helped lead authorities directly to her, ensuring that her abusive ex-husband would never see the light of day again. After Karen left him in the mid-1970s, Mike DeBardeleben seems to have begun counterfeiting bills for the first time, while he would resort to using $20 bills years later for his mall passer scheme. This first attempt had seen him counterfeit $100 bills, and his lack of care or attention quickly led authorities right to him. Following an investigation overseen by the Secret Service, federal agents raided a home belonging to Mike DeBardeleben in 1976. The target of their ongoing investigation, Mike lived in Arlington, Virginia at the time, and his home along 1201 South Columbus Street proved a curious crime scene for the investigators that searched it. Inside, agents found the home in a state of total disarray. Objects and items were scattered everywhere, and there was no real sense that it had been a true home to anyone. Many of the rooms were filled with sex-related paraphernalia, such as pornographic magazines and pictures, most of which were rough and/or aggressive in nature, many sex toys, dildos, vibrators, whips, etc. And one room even automatically projected pornographic movies when agents opened up the door. They also found dozens of firearms, along with thousands of rounds of ammunition. Suspiciously, during that search, investigators also found several 5x7 note cards containing details such as women's names, their addresses, their physical measurements, as well as other characteristics, including ratings of the women's features. Behind a locked padlock door, they found a large printing machine, along with proof of the homeowner's counterfeiting operation, bills in various stages of completion, plates, inks, all that they needed to sink Mike DeBardeleben for counterfeiting. In an interview with Mike's then-estranged wife, Karen, she told investigators that Mike would kill her if she talked to them. Her lawyer advised her not to cooperate, and she quickly disappeared. Investigators at the time believed that there was much more to Mike DeBardeleben than they had originally assumed, but their role in the investigation was over. With him going to prison for counterfeiting, that was that. In 1976, he was sentenced to 3 years in prison, time that he would spend at the federal penitentiary in Danbury, Connecticut. During his incarceration, Mike DeBardeleben would write, "I feel that I have been unjustly tormented, degraded, and shit upon by society, specifically the American justice system, which is rotten to the core. In order to regain an adequate self-image, I feel compelled to somehow restore my self-respect. If I were to shit upon society for an adequate monetary gain, commensurate with the pain I have suffered and not get caught, it would accomplish my objective." After serving just 23 months of his 3-year sentence, Mike DeBardeleben was released from prison in 1978. He spent some time at a halfway house before moving back to the DC area, buying a home in Arlington, Virginia. At around the same time, he would purchase a 1977 Ford Thunderbird, the vehicle that he would begin to travel around the US with. Surprisingly, Mike would marry once again to a young woman named Barbara, who he would use his typical shtick upon. After marrying her, he would make her into one of his accomplices in his various schemes, but he seemed to spare her from the physical abuse he had subjected his previous ex-wives to. However, he did not shy away from making her listen to the prior audio tapes that he had created, nor from showing her the photos of the women he had abused in the past. He also made her take nude photos of her own, and made her indulge him in whatever sex acts he desired. Barbara was forced to cooperate with Mike's various schemes and robberies, but almost got in trouble after carrying out one of them in 1980. In order to avoid giving testimony on one another, the two married shortly thereafter. It seemed to Barbara that Mike was willing to let her take the fall for the two of them, and that's almost exactly what happened. She ended up getting jail time for the scheme, while Mike carried on with his travels, of which Barbara knew little. Later, investigators would learn that Mike was knee-deep in the mall passer scheme at this point. Whatever else he got up to during these travels was anyone's guess. Barbara would eventually leave Mike later in 1980, after he came down sick with pneumonia and was hospitalized. After that, she never saw him again. Mike, however, continued on with the mall passer scheme. After losing his most recent accomplice, he seems to have committed himself fully to the counterfeiting operation, traversing the US for many months before being caught in May of 1983. Using the knowledge he had obtained during his prosecution and subsequent incarceration, this counterfeiting operation avoided many of the pitfalls of the first. But even then, it wasn't foolproof. Secret Service agents would eventually catch on to the mall passer, before arresting Mike in a mall outside of Knoxville, Tennessee. After that, a quick prosecution followed. Mike was sentenced to years in prison, but that was just a pittance compared to the time that would eventually follow. Mike DeBardeleben would spend the rest of his natural life in prison, dying behind bars in 2011 of pneumonia. However, with his death, he would take many of his secrets with him. As investigators learned more about this strange, sadistic man, they discovered that they knew just a fraction of the crimes he had committed, many of which remain clouded in mystery to this day. That's on the next episode of Unresolved. Thank you all for listening to this episode of Unresolved. I am your host, Michael Whelan. This episode was researched, written, and produced by myself. I also put together the music heard throughout the episode, except where noted in the show notes. The amazing producers of the show, who support it each month on Patreon, are Roberta Jansen, Sarah Moscaratolo, Brandy Nordine, Jacinta Klass, Alex Calaragopoulos, Scott Meesey, Ben Crocum, Patrick Loxo, Marion Welsh, Lauren Nicole, Sally Ranford, Riddis Baugh, James Weiss, Stephen Diaz, Derek Smith, Heather Fiddler, Crystal J, and Zach Cass. Thank you all for your continued support. It really does keep the show alive. I would also like to thank the rest of the patrons who support this show each month on Patreon. You can become a producer or a patron by heading to patreon.com/unresolvedpod, where you can get access to commercial-free episodes, our entire archive of bonus episodes, and every episode of the Patreon-exclusive show, Resolved. There, I take a look at solved cases, such as the 2014 4chan killer, or cannibalistic serial killer Richard Chase. More recently, I took a look at a notorious armed thief from Las Vegas, which is a wild story. Check it out and subscribe to the Patreon if you're interested in learning more. For everyone else, thanks for listening. Make sure to continue spreading word of this podcast with your friends, family, to those you know on social media, or wherever else you can think of. Thanks for those of you who do. And a special thanks to those of you that are continuing to give the podcast great reviews on Apple Podcast or other podcast platforms. Those really do go a long way. This past year, I gave notice that I may be bringing the show to a close at the end of this season. At this point, I'm much more likely to keep the show alive into 2025 and beyond, but I really do need your support. If you can, join the Patreon. If you can't, then just try and spread the good word. Keep those reviews coming in. Share the show on social media. Hit up some subreddits with episode recommendations, stuff like that. I would really like to keep making this a full-time show, but podcast advertising is in the dumps right now, and it's gonna take all of us to keep this show going. I would love to keep focusing on the content and get episodes out to you every week, but I just need a little bit of help. If you like this show and you would like to hear more, please go spread the word, leave a review, or if you can spare it, please join the Patreon. Anyhow, until next time, I hope you all stay healthy, stay active, and most importantly, stay safe. I'll talk to you all later. When authorities captured Mike DeBardeleben in 1983 and began to look through the items in his possession, in addition to the dozens of tape recordings he had left behind, they uncovered a lot of his writings. With these writings, they began to figure out many of the acronyms and abbreviations he regularly used, codes that he used in order to make his life easier as he documented his goals, aspirations, and crimes. He was meticulous in keeping track of everything, keeping extensive documentation for almost everything using this shorthand. However, as authorities began to learn more about Mike DeBardeleben, these initials began to stick out as particularly troubling. Some were for everyday things or even people. For example, when he was married to his wife Karen, he often abbreviated her name to just C. But others were more troubling. One that appeared from time to time was KRK, and authorities began to theorize that meant kidnap, rape, kill. Another that appeared on occasion was SMB, an aspirational goal that Mike hoped to attain, one of his uttermost fantasies. Authorities later theorized that this meant sadomasochistic bitch. Keep that in mind because you're about to hear an actual audio recording from Mike DeBardeleben, one of the few snippets that's ever been released to the public.
Number 1, establish a new identity. Second, buy a house according to my own specifications and needs, with a secret fun area, which would include a cage so that I could have a SMB locked up. Of prime importance, top priority, would be an incinerator capable of incinerating at an extremely high temperature. Total incineration.